Look at that. Look at that countdown.
That was great.
I know. Hello, everyone. We'll start right on time because we're here right at 2 with the little countdown thing. But hello, all of you that are hanging out on here. I know that quite a few of you have already been sharing in the chat where you're from. But, Diana and I are pretty excited about Empty Altars. So many people joined us last year during Lent where we talked about our Jesus books and Jesus because we're fans, despite what I read on the internet. And one member that joined this class who's very interested how two heretical non-Christians would ever talk about saints. But we're going to figure that out together, Diana. So are you ready?
Before everybody came on, I was telling you how it's the anniversary of the day in church history when the Eastern Roman emperor in 380 made subscribing to the creed an absolute necessity for all citizens. And so welcome to this, sort of really important day in the history of the church.
Oh, yeah. And y'all didn't know this, but Diana wants to dedicate all of her contributions to sheer love of creeds. She really loves them. Literally.
Well, I thought I would play to type to the person who was worried about my heresy.
Well, yeah. Well, so just a few, housekeeping things to note. All of you that are on here, this is Empty Altars, where we'll be hanging out each Monday through Lent together and exploring American saints for a cynical age. What we're hoping to do as we go through the class is each week there are these different themes that you see on the class page, and we will each be picking out a figure or two to explore around those themes, and then we'll post it in the group, and y'all can respond in the Facebook group or in email. We want to have a giant collection of all the different figures as well that each of you have if you're thinking about these particular virtues and how they're expressed. So we want to interact that way, but also questions and such. If you have questions, you can obviously put them in the chat, but you want to put the word question in front so I can save them for the Q&A time, or you can email them. That's also an option. And we will be able to interact with those. This week is a little different, a tighter schedule of sorts because it's the intro. But if you happen to be one of the people hopping on this stream because it is open to anyone for the first week as a lure of sorts, then you too can head over to emptyaltars.com where you can join the class, be here the rest of the weeks, hang out with us on the internet and have some fun. So, yeah. Okay. Can you think of anything else we need to say before, jumping in, Diana?
No, I think you covered that part really well, Tripp. Thanks.
Well, that's good. All righty. Well, here we go. Now, to give you all a little framework of introducing the class and such, Diana's going to open things up, and then we'll talk about it, and then start digging into the saints for week 1.
Yeah, the title of the class we're doing this year, I think, is very compelling. Empty Altars, American Saints for a Cynical Age. And the title comes from both of us, in case you haven't heard Tripp and I talking about this before. The main title, Empty Altars, comes from a conversation that I had with a Baptist pastor in Richmond, Virginia, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And American Saints in a Cynical Age comes from Tripp. And so we have put our minds together around this subject in order to create this journey that we both want to go on with you. So let me tell you first about the Empty Altars part of the title as way of introduction. Last fall, I was in Richmond, Virginia at a very liberal Baptist church there celebrating their anniversary. And part of my job was to talk about history. So I gave a lecture about why church history or why history is a spiritual practice. And right before I was getting behind the pulpit to share my remarks, the pastor was just chatting with me. And he asked me, he said, have you been on Monument Avenue recently? And Monument Avenue is the long, 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 beautiful boulevard in Richmond, Virginia, that was basically created after the Civil War. The city was relatively, it was pretty much destroyed in the war. And so, as part of the recovery, they created Monument Boulevard, and it's a beautiful street. And the way it was designed was to have these circles where every so often there would be a statue in the middle of the road. And all of the statues from the time Monument Boulevard was put up in the late 19th century until just recently were of Confederate heroes. There's a huge statue of Robert E. Lee, and then there were all sorts of other Confederate generals going down Monument Boulevard. Well, this had become controversial, obviously, in the last several years in Virginia, last several decades, actually. People have been complaining about them. But it was not until 2020 and 2021 did the statues finally start coming down. And that's what the pastor was referring to, is that the statues were gone. So he said, "Have you been down Monument Avenue lately?" And I knew what he was talking about. Have you seen the statues? Have been taken down. And I said, "No, I haven't driven down there lately." And then he looked at me and he said, "You really should. Every time I look down the street, I see empty altars everywhere." And I literally stopped in my tracks, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, what a compelling image." And what a compelling image for our own age. Because right now, we're living in a time when the altars of church and the altars of our public lives have changed radically. And people have really become iconoclasts and torn down familiar icons of that marked the lives of people who came in generations before us. And so saints and heroes have been knocked off of pedestals everywhere. And it's not just Richmond, it's all over what used to be Western Christendom. I know that we have lots of Canadians and lots of Europeans on this call, lots of Australians. And our public spaces are all being questioned by important issues right now. And in many places, statues have been taken down or defaced, or buildings are empty. And we're trying to think about what it will be like to create a public space that has this sort of spiritual element, I think, for the future. So that was the impetus for the title Empty Altars, this evocative phrase that describes our time. In the last couple weeks, as Tripp and I began to talk about this, several people sent me questions, and one of those questions was really moving. And the fellow said, "Well, why not leave them empty?" And the reason why, I think, is that human beings always fill altars. We have as much as we love tearing things down, as iconoclastic as we can be as human beings, we also build altars. And it's almost as soon as an altar is torn down, we put something else up in its place. And so the question is, how can we be more intentional and reflective about what arises in our public religious spaces, our public political spaces, our communal spaces, so that it's not just sort of like this accidental hodgepodge of anything we happen to worship. Um, so that's where the title comes from. And then Tripp added this piece about American saints in a cynical age, because the empty altars creates, I think, within us a certain kind of cynicism. Why fill the altars at all? It's an impossible task. It can never be done. And you can see how the two things are actually connected with cynicism. So the second piece that I want to say by way of introduction is, well, what is a saint and why did you use that word? Which is the other question I've been asked in recent weeks, mostly from Catholic friends who said, "Oh, I love this idea. It's a wonderful idea. But as soon as somebody says the word saint, I just freak out. It just reminds me too much of my childhood." We have this very sort of firm idea in Catholicism what a saint is. And so I just want to give sort of three quick guidelines as to how I think about saints. And what Tripp and I are meaning when we talk about American saints in a cynical age. And American saints is not to exclude anybody. It's just talking out of the culture we know best. And we are really looking forward, actually, to our friends from other countries to be adding stories along the way of your saints, people who you admire in your contexts, and that you can become teachers to all of us by adding those names in. So the first principle, why do we do this kind of stuff? Why do we make saints at all? Well, the saints, when Tripp and I talk about saints, it's not that we're trying to set up an icon that you're supposed to worship. Because from our perspective, at least, this crafting of the idea of saints for public space is not really about the saints. It's not about creating idols for the future that our children and grandchildren have to take down. It's really about us. And it's about us in terms of education. Um, Educational theory shows that human beings at our sort of very primal levels learn by imitation. And so a baby watching its mother will begin to understand, what it means to be part of this species. A baby listening to its father will begin to pick up language and ideas. Human beings learn by imitation. In effect, there's that old saying, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. No, it's how we learn. And so if you have a statue, say, of Robert E. Lee in the public square in Richmond, Virginia, and a little kid is walking by with, say, his mom, and they look up, the little kid says, "Who's that?" And the mother says, "Oh, that's Robert E. Lee. That's the great hero of the American Civil War. He was a good and kind man, gentle with his slaves." Well, the little kid begins to learn a story of imitation of the previous generation. And it's a way that we actually inculcate the stories that went before us. So saints are part of that imitational education process by which we figure out the kind of people we want to be. Who do we want to emulate? Who do we want to imitate? And what do we learn about those figures in terms of our own humanity and the humanity of others? And so that's the first thing. Saints aren't about them in particular. Saints are about us. Second, saints uphold ideals, principles, and qualities that we desire for ourselves and community. And so it's about even more than just the individual figure. It's about what that figure represents. And so is it about compassion or courage or justice or equality? What does that person's story teach us about who we want to be? And then conversely, the values, ideals, and beliefs that we already hold are part of what makes a saint. So we generally pick saints who match ideals that we aspire to or already hold. So it's a little bit of a paradox here that the saints uphold the ideals that we want to pursue, but the saints are also they come out of the experience of the values that we already hold. And so this gives us a really wonderful chance during Lent to think about what our sort of core uh, commitments are in terms of our values for our own lives and for our communities. And then third, I want to be really clear about this, and I think this is a very interesting path for us to continue to pursue over all of the 6 weeks we're together, is that those statues down that Monument Avenue in Richmond, originally they were about heroes of the Confederacy. And in effect, those statues became saints. They became saints of a civil religion referred to as the religion of the lost cause. And so here you have the state of Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, now unwilling really to give in and say, okay, well, we lost the military battle, But this was actually printed and preached in sermons and newspapers all over the South, and particularly in Virginia, in the late 19th and early 20th century. We may have lost the military battle, but we were always more moral than those Northerners. And so that they began to ascribe these moral characteristics of courage, compassion, kindness, etc., to those military heroes that they were putting up in those statues along Monument Avenue. Now, that's a place where heroes and saints sort of conflate into a kind of civil religion. And it's pretty easy to see that one now because lots of scholars have done work on it, and we're talking about it much more here in the United States. Some of our invisible heroes who have become saints, it's a little harder to pull those threads apart. But we're also having arguments about those too. I happen to live on ground. You can see it out the window. You can see the cottage out the window, actually. But my house sits on ground that was once part of the Mount Vernon estate and plantation. This was a plantation that was owned by George Washington. And the only people who worked it were enslaved people. And so, this is where my house is. This is where my whole neighborhood is. This is where this gigantic set of neighborhoods south of Washington, D.C. is. And so just now we're beginning to talk about Washington and this land and what this land means and what that other story means. And so it's not quite as in your face as Monument Avenue, but these are subtle threads that we have woven of kind of political heroism and moral sainthood, which is sort of fascinating. Sam Wells, and this is the last thing I'll say by way of introduction, who is a Church of England minister. I don't know if he's a bishop now. Somebody might want to put that in the chat for me. He's very well regarded. He taught for years at Duke, and he has written about the difference between heroes and saints. And I think, first of all, nations have heroes. Military coups have heroes. Lots of people have heroes. But the question that Tripp and I are exploring is maybe we need less in the way of heroes and more in the way of saints. So, what's a saint and what's a hero? Well, Sam Wells says this, and I'm going to read you directly from an article he wrote. The hero always makes a decisive intervention at a moment when all things are looking like they couldn't go at a moment when things are looking like they could all go badly wrong. The hero steps up and makes everything turn out right. In other words, the hero is always the center of the story. By contrast, Wells continues, the saint is not necessarily the crucial character. The saint may be almost invisible, easily missed, quickly forgotten. The saint is always at the periphery of a story that is really about God and community. And I think that is what we're really kind of trying to move towards, is that heroes stand alone. Saints are with us, in us, because of us. Saints are part of community. Saints are at the periphery. Saints are often missed. And those are the kinds of stories that Tripp and I want to hold up over the next 6 weeks. Stories that have often been missed. And sometimes they're going to be stories that have been missed about people who are relatively famous and who could be counted among heroes. And sometimes these are people who are just missed and whose stories are being now recovered or who are under threat of being completely forgotten, when actually something about the story that they bear and the community they were part of creates a wisdom that we may want to carry with us into a new future, that they are worthy guides, models for our public spaces, worthy of imitation, so that we can all learn together how to act more humanly at this difficult time in which we live.
Yeah. So, one of the well, I guess there are a few things I thought we might want to make sure to mention up front, and one is just how contested history is at this moment. Now you're a historian, but I think one of the challenges of thinking through our history and performing publicly the risk of sainting people is just how contested it is. Like a lot of that cynicism of the present moment is connected to our growing awareness of our history and our uncomfortability with some of particular moments or histories, or even the inertia in institutions and such. What kind of advice do you have for both for us to both recognize the predicament but not be closed off from re-narrating what we inherit to look for a better horizon?
Well, one of the things that I really want to encourage people to do is slow down a little bit and really listen. One of the things that I kind of laughed about that immediately came up in the questions is I was talking about this land and the plantation and the enslavement that happened here. And somebody popped in and said, "Well, what about the First Nations people who live there?" Well, you know what? Take me out to coffee, and I can tell you everything that happened on this piece of land going back to any kind of recorded history. And see, the assumption in that kind of question is you sort of are jumping in and you're performing immediately that you know some deeper part of the story, or you're more aware, or that I've missed something and that I'm not as on my boat as I should be, about what happens in this place and time. And that's part of what I mean by slow down. Is that one of the things that I do by and large is when I enter into a public conversation, and especially when I was a classroom teacher, is that I assume the best of the people who are in my classroom. And maybe that's a really bad thing for me to do, but I'm not a Calvinist. And I'm just not going to walk in and say, "You're all miserable, ignorant sinners, and you don't know the story, and I'm here to tell it to you." Or I'm here to prove to you how incredibly progressive I am, so that I'm going to get great points with my far left wing dean at my university. None of that works for me. What works for me is that we're together on a journey of learning. We live in a difficult time. The land we bear and the land we occupy and the stories we bear are complicated and deep and profoundly layered. And it takes the patience of an archaeologist to excavate those layers. And if you jump in with a shovel and just go whoom, really fast, you're going to destroy all of the subtlety of that history and everything that can be learned from the quiet, gentle peeling back of each one of those layers. And there was actually an interesting and great story about this in Alexandria itself, where I live. Richmond's a little bit down the road. I live in Alexandria, which is closer to DC. Well, it is DC. And there was, for many years when we first moved here, at a very significant intersection in southern Alexandria, on the way to where this place is that I live, right across the street from the Roman Catholic cemetery, a gas station. And on that under that gas station was the first ever freedmen's black cemetery in Northern Virginia. There were dead bodies of Black people under that gas station, and they had been unmarked, unloved, plastered over by a gas station for 50, 70, 80 years, something to that effect. Well, right across the street, the white Catholic cemetery, was intact. So over the last 10 years, and every time I drove past it, it would drive me crazy. I would say, "They got to tear that gas station down." Well, it took 10 years. It took 10 years for archaeologists, historians, construction crews, and everyone to get in there to remove the gas station and peel into those layers. And now what sits there is this very evocative, um, memorial that has a wall with as many names as people know of those people who were buried there, where there are actually markings of particular graves that they do know. And then stories that have been lost through the history of Alexandria over the last 150 to 200 years. And I remember as that was happening, I kept thinking, you got to speed that up. You have to speed that up. But you couldn't. You couldn't just go in and with a bulldozer and take that gas station down, because if you did, there would have been even more destruction and disturbing of the stories that lay underneath. And so that's what I think is really important about this kind of practice during Lent. We're actually inviting people into thinking about history and sainthood and the kind of people we want to be and the kind of people we want to emulate as that slow, reflective process of asking ourselves, how do we create these stories in public spaces as we move into a different future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you shared that about the challenge of slowing down and such, I'm reminded of one of St. Phyllis Tickle's critical retorts to me, where when I was in my 20s, she said, "Tripp, the kingdom does not come by criticism alone." And then she would give me the Phyllis Tickle smirk. And I remember experiencing that because there was this instinct or this like energy that comes from when you feel seized by some awareness of the divine, and then the people that are your own people who taught you the love of Christ, right? Like that built you up are the ones that are like, I don't know what you're talking about, Tripp. Sounds like your crazy socialist agenda, or, like you're a little hippie peacenik, or, these kind of things. And you're like, no. And in the energy of wanting to make sure that they all understood my criticism, I think closes you off sometimes from creating the kind of connections that can lead to flourishing.
And to be perfectly clear, we're not talking about doing social justice action here on the streets.
Yeah.
That's, there's a difference between laws that need to be changed for the expediency of saving people's lives and for the doing of justice, and the recalculation and reconstruction of stories that carry us into a more hopeful future. Those are two different kinds of work. And when Martin Luther King was criticizing the white moderates, he was criticizing those people who were moving too slow in that first regard, that people's lives were at risk. And the second regard is, the statues are ripped down. I'm not complaining about that. Those came down. When they came down fast. And it had been a long time already, and they deserve to come down when they did. But now the question is not go out and rip down statues. The iconoclastic part of this has been done. The speedy urgency piece of it has happened. This is the part of the reconstruction. And so it's literally like deconstruction and reconstruction. People talk about that a lot in terms of faith. Sometimes deconstructions have to happen very quickly because someone is being hurt, or someone's are being hurt. And that has to stop. Harm has to cease. But the reconstruction piece, that's what we're talking about here, is this reconstructive spiritual project that really does take reflection. And that, like I said, that sort of archaeological touch. And King wasn't talking about that when he was criticizing white moderates. King was that was not something that he was addressing. This is a different kind of project than the one that he was addressing. And both projects have merit, and both projects are important for the future. But they shouldn't be confused either.
Mm-hmm. One of the ways that I've actually been thinking about this and going through the different themes, for each week, and going, who are the ones who are the figures who function as saints for me? Like, so the people I picked and the ones you picked, they were selected because of our connection to them. And I think everyone should know that going in, right? Like, you won't be surprised that Tripp the Baptist has a number of Baptists in his, and it's like the ones I wish all the crazy Baptists, that's my value judgment, I wish they knew and held dearly. And so like part of the exciting part for me, it's one, us getting to share the ones that have struck us, and then hearing who are the people whose stories have inspired and brought anyone to show up here, right? The other the other thing that you mentioned that's really helpful for me in thinking about the act of retelling a story, you talked about how the altars or monuments are about us, not about them, and this nature of imitation. In kind of psychology, one of the powers of mimetic desire, or the internalizing of desire by imitation, is that we've learned it not only happens just directly, right, between parents at first, and then you get involved in a culture, and then you start to internalize the desires of the stories you tell. But one of the more powerful technologies of desire formation is religion. And we could have a long excursus that would make us go really late. But I would say if we recognize that religion is a technology of desire formation, and that human desire is currently transforming our planet and our relationships in destructive ways, then one of the ways you can pass the faith on, and hopefully one that doesn't get immediately condemned in the next generation, right, is to go, what are the stories that help form our desire to resonate with the desire of the divine? And I think that is why the people I've selected, the ones I know you've selected, stuck out, is because I hope the way in their context in history, this particular part of their desire shaped their life. I want that to be internalized in me in some way, or to challenge me in some way. And that it can be a part of a community who are looking at the world going, the way our desires, individual and collective, are playing out is less than the beauty, justice-filled vision of Christ. So let us bind our desires in different ways.
I'm so excited about the way you said that. I mean, actually, I just loved that, every word of it. And it makes me think about, right now, our desire really has been for a hero. And if you heard that what Wells said about that, he said, the hero always makes a decisive intervention at a moment when things are looking like they could all go badly. And see, that's what people have been looking for politically, a political hero who will basically provide some sort of intervention to fix everything, right? And that's what the hero is. But that always winds up being about the individual. And so we keep having this habit in Western culture of holding up these people as heroes. And then when they show themselves to have clay feet, or they're, complete idiots or what have you, we then say, oh, there are no heroes. There's nothing that can be fixed. I'm just going to sit here and drink myself silly, or it doesn't matter whether or not I do X, Y, Z. It's all hopeless. We're all going to die. And so our quest for heroes and the quick fixes are actually one of the things that keep backfiring on us in that scheme that you present. Whereas the idea, this is why we're going after the idea of saint rather than hero, is that the saint is not the quick fix. The saint may be almost invisible, easily missed, quickly forgotten. The saint is at the periphery, questioning, working from the edges, imagining a different kind of world, gathering community. This longer kind of quiet work that has a huge impact over time, and might even have an impact on and I think actually does have an impact on the shorter term, but it's not that kind of immediate miraculous fix that the hero, is the victor of the war, the victor of the story. We can point to the person who saved us all. I don't think that is really what, certainly when I talk to my Gen Z daughter and her friends, they're not looking for one person to fix everything right now. They're actually trying to figure out what stories, what communities will press the earth toward the kind of healing that it needs. So anyway, you were perfect. And I want to hear your two people today. I want to hear your visionaries and prophets. We should get started with our folks. So we start giving examples of what we're hoping to do on this journey.
All right. Excellent. All right. Well, so we've each picked two people, and then obviously we won't introduce the thing each week. And now you may be saying to yourself, Tripp, don't you study philosophy and theology? Why are you going to talk about his history in front of Diana? Well, I am a glutton for punishment and unedifying responses. Now, because of the way we've even framed this, what I've done today, I picked two people. One, Roger Williams, and the other, Abraham Lincoln. And, they could easily be picked for other parts of this study, other themes of the week, or they could be ignored and cut off for other things they both thought and practiced, right? And so part of what I'm hoping to do in articulating my love of Roger Williams and what I've learned recently in reading through a couple Lincoln biographies and his writings is how I would like to tell their story to my children. That was the framework. So there's plenty more about them that you can't do if you're talking about two figures in 30 minutes, So just assume, well, I definitely know it all if it's Roger Williams, and because I've read most of that, and but Abe Lincoln, I'm sure there's plenty I don't know, but I fell in love with him precisely because we found that image of the Lincoln Memorial with no statue on it. And I was like, that is so good. I think I want to read a Lincoln book. And then it read to me going through a couple. And so I've picked places to wrestle with my cynicism as I hand on the faith to Elgin and Haven and Cora. So first is Roger Williams and the ghost of John Cotton. Now, John Cotton is Roger Williams, the Puritan come to America's opponent in Massachusetts Bay Colony. It is a conflict about the nature of Puritan religion, and the ghost of John Cotton, the ghost of Puritan religion, is one that I think's alive and well. And when I think about handing on the radical side of my Baptist inheritance to my kids, I'm like, you gotta take Roger Williams and all 8 months of him being a Baptist seriously, because his radical vision of what's required for the flourishing of faith in a multi-religious democracy is not the coercion of the state, but the freedom of each consciousness. And what was it that drove Roger Williams? That truth wins. That's what he was committed to. The dignity of the person before God, the liberty of their conscience to wrestle and experience truth, and that through the use of reason and the faculties God gave all people, and the experience of the divine encountered in the life of the church, that is ultimately compelling, and the fidelity of a church when it's coerced by the state undoes its goodness. Now, Puritan religion, when Roger Williams comes on the scene, he's born in 1603. He has a conversion experience as a teenager, becomes a legal assistant, then gets into Cambridge, and he goes to America. And 8 months after he gets to America, hanging out with all the Puritans, he gets kicked out. Now, you may be saying to yourself, whoa, why did he get kicked out of Massachusetts? Well, he was like a hot take master artists. And now I'm going to list some of them. Some of them are horrible. Not going to tell those to my kids till they get a little bit older, For example, he was like, no, women should wear veils in church. Not a keeper. I'm against it. But then he's like, hey, we should not have a cross on the English flag. Do you know how many Christians we've killed? Quality move. If you don't think that one's still a hot take, try taking the flag out of your church's sanctuary and see the attendance the following Sunday. He was also against forcing people that weren't Christians to swear oaths on a Bible. He was like, what do you do? You're making them lie. They don't believe it. You're now like making them pretend they believe it. Like that's as if you're going to get it. See, again, high quality move. I like that one. But the two biggies that despite the things I'm not thrilled with, Roger Williams being a hyper Calvinist, being a bit of a patriarchal curmudgeon from everything we know about his family relationships, but he had two hot takes that were so hot, I'm down for retweeting them. One, and this is what John Cotton, his Puritan opponent, said: can you trust a man who insists that civil magistrates' power extends only to the bodies and goods of men and their outward state? Can you trust someone who doesn't want the government to coerce fidelity on the insides? Yes, we can. We can trust him. That's a great idea. But you see, the thing that first hot take of his that I find so powerful is that he's sitting there looking at Puritan religion. They escape, right, Europe. They come and then they start a colony. And then what do? They go, well, if you run the state, just like all the other states that are warring in Europe, you determine its religion. And we actually agree with them in England and in France and in the different Protestant states in Germany that survival of the state depends on uniformity of religious belief and practice. And so, since they manage to get out of that Anglican compromise and go and found a new colony, the Puritans wanted the state to enforce both of the statutes of the Ten Commandments. They wanted to support not how we treat our neighbor, like the second of the tablets, which Roger Williams is like, great. And if you do that, it's really hard to coerce the first one. But they also wanted the state to enforce the first half of the Ten Commandments, know God before me, all that kind of stuff. Now, when there's no respect for an individual's religious conscience because the ruling elites think that the state determines the religion and their legislative priority is both the inside and the outside of the person, then where is the freedom of the divine? Where does it operate? How is history being shaped? And Roger Williams goes and says, you cannot look at the history of Christians killing each other, in fighting over everything and being ridiculous, and then say to yourself, you know what? I think we just need to start another pure state and give it puritanical power. This drive for authoritarian religion and purity of the church was a fear that drove Puritan religion that you see Roger Williams resist in very, very specific ways through the founding of Providence, Rhode Island. Now, I'll say a bit about that in a second, but the other big one, biggie, is that he thought Native Americans had property rights.
I know, it's amazing.
I know. And when he gets exiled, because John Cotton was like, did you check out this guy? He wants to get rid of the cross off the flag and let people's own conscience determine be their guide. He's actually saved by the local Native American tribe. They kick him out in the middle of winter. While he's there, he ends up creating the first dictionary for Europeans to use to understand the language of the local native tribes. In it, he says this when he got to when he ends up setting up Rhode Island. Oh, here's a funny one. So he develops a key to the language of the Americans, which is his book. In it, where he advocated that native peoples should be the sole owners of the land, and if you get it, they should be compensated for it. You'd have to buy the land from them. He makes a few observations that I bet plenty of us will resonate with. I don't know how back in the 1600s Roger Williams read his poetry, but this is my attempt. Boast not, proud English, of thy birth and blood. Thy brother Indian is by birth as good. Of one blood God made him, and thee and all, as wise, as fair, as strong, and as personal. In it, you see, and this is him responding to John Cotton, where he's like, hey, I think you might be confused. God made humans, and I've hung out with the Native Americans, and guess what? They're made of the same blood, and there's only one God, so I guess we know who made them. And if you get to know them, you might find out they're actually nicer than you and smarter than you and as strong as you, and they deeply value relationships, so chew on it. Right, like, so again, granted, we don't use prose like that to troll anymore, but it's high quality. And then he got lambasted, and John Cotton and company are like, look, this is why we shouldn't trust Roger Williams. How does he holler back? With a fun poem. When Indians hear the horrid filths of Irish Englishmen, the horrid oaths and murthers late, thus say these Indians then, we wear no clothes and have many gods, yet our sins are less. You, English, are barbarians, pagans wild. Your land is the wilderness. Come on, that's high quality trolling. And I'm just saying, when you think about how offensive it is sometimes when people claim they want the power on behalf of God to determine the insides and outsides of each person. How often do we, like Roger Williams, go, could you just talk to your own first? I know there hadn't been any recent experiences like this, Diana, but sometimes the right-wing authoritarians desiring puritanical religion have a high-quality gift of selective offense. And here he points out that he points out the problems, but what he underneath it, his theological statement is that each individual, regardless of culture and the will of their conscience, bears the image and value of God. So you see this. He goes to the Native Americans, purchases the land, starts Providence, Rhode Island as the first place that you didn't have to believe the same thing the state doesn't prescribe religious beliefs. When he founded it, he said, I, having made covenant of peaceable neighborhood with all the schemes and natives around us, and having in a sense God's merciful providence unto me in my distress, called the place Providence. I desired it might be a shelter for the distressed of conscience. I communicated my said purchase unto my loving friends, who then desired to take shelter with thee. So this desire in Williams for religious liberty meant he risked building community, and he risked forming a space where what was privileged was the freedom of the individual to respond to God across difference, even contested difference. And that he thought was the fertile ground for flourishing faith, not the coercion of the state, even if you seize the Supreme Court. Now, Williams, he thought lots of people were wrong. He's notorious for arguing with the Puritans, like I've said. And I find just the titles of Roger Williams and John Cotton's taunts towards each other entertaining. So John Cotton, after he gets kicked out, writes a treatise called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for the Cause of Conscience Discussed. And then John Cotton, hollering back on behalf of the Puritans, wrote a response. It said, the bloody tenet, washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb. Well, I'm not going to say anything else about what he said, because I would have had to give a really bad Reformed theology trigger warning, but I bet you can guess. And then Roger Williams respond. These guys were on Twitter, it would have been classic. There've been a lot of quote tweets. So the quote tweet of Roger Williams here is, the bloody tenet, yet more bloody, by Mr. Cotton's endeavor to wash it white in the blood of the Lamb. Right. And underneath it, he goes, you already said it was bad. Look, you let the state be in charge and trying to coerce everyone. You just end up killing people, and you never know what they really believe. And then you make a farce of the fact that the God of love is at the source of this. That's nut. And then he tries to justify it. Now, I just want him to know he made it even more worse by admitting that he's that crazy. You know, you could just see him going like, I told you. That's why, occasionally I tell friends like our mutual friend Mason and his Twitter status, I'm like, you tweet like Roger Williams. Any pushback inspires snarky asides. He rescued Ann Hutchinson, like invited her into Rhode Island when she gets kicked out for getting the Holy Ghost and talking too much. She didn't wear a veil, and Roger Williams had her in Providence. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, became a part of Providence, Rhode Island, and then Roger Williams goes, great, I can debate them because they're crazy. So you have to recognize one of the things Roger Williams did is he was able to differentiate a person's value before God and the demand it makes upon him as a follower of Christ from how he thought about their ideas. He didn't see anyone, friend or foe, and go, they are their ideas. That is a beautiful gift. I have a hard time differentiating myself from ideas, let alone people I know are wrong. And Roger Williams gives it. And the reason is, on behalf of truth, we should have religious liberty. So for him,
That's amazing, Tripp. I'm sorry. I just can't stop thinking of Roger Williams in a tweet war like the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah, I think he would have Gospel Coalition, contradiction in terms.
Right.
Like he has these two lines, and I thought I was picking out ones for like the two virtues. Like if I was going to have two quotes of his on the wall, for him, religious liberty and religious freedom is not a means to get the state power so it can force you to be an evangelical Republican. The state support and coercion of conscience for him is not an asset for genuine faith, but an impediment. And here's the quote: that a civil sword, as woeful experience in all ages hath proved, is so far from bringing or helping forward an opposite religion to repentance, that magistrates sin grievously against the work of God and blood of souls by such proceedings. Roger Williams looks at the history of the church and says, hey, when did the civil sword really help us out? Is it when the Roman Empire hooked up with the church and all of a sudden we were running interference and telling stories to justify its political imperial campaigns? Was it in the Crusades? Was it in the 30 Years' War where everyone figured out how to be the true church and kill all the others? Like, at what point is the state's support and coercion of conscience anything but an enemy to genuine faith? It was on behalf of the church that Roger Williams said, keep the state out my church. It is so tempting at a time of we're moving more and more into a post-Christian century to wish that once we're not culture dominant, let us seize the reins of power and determine our neighbor's living. He resisted. The other big quote is that he insisted that non-Christians make good citizens too, and definitely better than his buddy, John Cotton. The quote, he says, whether or not such as may hold forth other worships or religions, Jews, Turks, or even anti-Christians, may they not be peaceable and quiet subjects, loving and helpful to neighbors, fair and just dealers, true and loyal to the civil government? Yes, it is clear they may. From both reason and experience in many flourishing cities and kingdoms of the world. Roger Williams there, I think, shows us something we need to learn again outside the context of Christian privilege in American religion, is that the ability to be citizens one to another is not something that only those with baby Jesus in their heart can do. And in fact, in giving each person and each community the ability to express and embody and bring their deep held values into the public square, you're not only able to be more faithful as a Christian, because Jesus gives almost no advice for wielding an imperial sword, but also you have the ability to practice your faith more deeply, communicate it more authentically, and do this crazy thing, not bear false witness. That is the biggest challenge, I think, that you see in Roger Williams that remains compelling, is that we don't need to justify our desires and the way we're engaged in the public square by bearing false witness on others and making them the scapegoat for all the problems. You can see this in people freaking out about particular books, drag queen story hour, all that kind of stuff. And then you can see it in progressive context, where just the idea of someone not being as progressive on a particular identity politic or whatever thing generates this deep animus. Do you have the ability to both be clear about your own convictions and be an ally for anyone to hold their own. And what is it that we protect? The violence towards bodies and land, and create an atmosphere of communication of conscience. That vision that you see in Rhode Island, ultimately, in Providence, Rhode Island, ultimately comes to shape the spirit of religious America. And it is one of the reasons I love Roger Williams, even though he's a hyper Calvinist Baptist for 8 months. I'm as far from a hyper Calvinist Baptist as it gets. I'm like the other side. I'm not a dry Baptist. I'm a wet Baptist. Particular Baptist is the word they usually use for the Reformed ones. I'm a general Baptist, and probably too general for most of them. Anyway, so but when I think about our cynical age, Roger Williams shows someone who becomes a neighbor and an advocate to all because he's animated by his deepest convictions.
So, well, that's pretty fantastic.
There you go. How close was I to the right time on that one?
Would you like me to talk about my two and then you move into Abraham Lincoln at the very end?
Yeah, do that, because I
think you need a breath.
Well, I also get real excited. Diana was like, well, we'll do, if we just do two of them. And I'm like, that's as long as a podcast intro. But no, anyway.
That was wonderful. I just want to say one of the things I have loved more than anything else about Roger Williams over the years is the title to that dictionary, Key to the Language of the Americans. I don't know if anybody caught that or not, but Roger Williams, in writing that title of his dictionary for the native people in New England, that's what he calls it, Keys to the Language of the Americans. No, you people are British. Yeah. People are the English. These are the Americans, the Native Americans. So anyway, that's well worth pointing out. And you did, thank you so much. I told you I wouldn't grade you as a church history professor, but that one gets an A+.
Ooh. Well, in that case, I'll take it.
So I want to talk about two women, and I think that these women will they combine in a number of really interesting ways. One is Mother Ann Lee, who is another figure from early American history. She was actually born in 1736, so she's a century after Roger Williams. And the other one is Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a woman from the 20th century, African-American, who was born in Mississippi in 1917. So 2 centuries apart, incredibly different worlds. Ann Lee, born in Manchester, England. And as I said a moment ago, Fannie Lou Hamer, born in Mississippi, post-Reconstruction and in the middle of the Jim Crow period. And so here I've picked these two women up. Tripp was going like, what? These are your two saints? Well, the first thing that I want to say about them is that they're both people from the periphery. And they're both people whose stories are under some threat of being forgotten. And yet they both say something incredibly important about women, about women's history. And I think about this whole topic today of vision and prophecy. And both of these women were visionaries in every sense of the word, and they were also both prophets. And so just so I'm going to more quickly cover, I think, Ann Lee. Ann Lee was born to a very poor family in Manchester, England, as I said a moment ago, in 1736 or 1738. And she was illiterate. Her parents were very poor, and there was no schooling that was available to a girl at her time, and she didn't learn how to read. She was sent by her parents to work in the cotton factories when she was just a small child. And so here is the great time of the Industrial Revolution in England, and she's one of the children who is put into forced labor at 6 or 7 years old to run these cotton mills. And of course, the cotton mills at that time in England are being supplied by slave labor in the American South. So this is a complex system of transatlantic economic gain for the wealthiest people and the exploitation of people in Africa, in the American South, and also among the poorest of the poor in England. She was always a little bit of sort of an odd child. She was kind of a little rebellious. She was very, very, very interested in religion. And when she was young, she told her parents that she didn't really want to get married, and they were shocked. Because of course, what else was a girl going to do besides get married? And so when she was a young woman, 16 or excuse me, 1758, her she joined a Quaker sect. The Quakers had been going for about a century, and they had sort of split into different kinds of factions across English. There were more sort of conventional Quakers that become the quiet Quakers that we think about. But there was always this one strain of the Quakers that was a bit more expressive, that still practiced. The Quakers got their name originally because they quaked in worship. The Holy Spirit would so overcome them. Think about the Asbury revival that's going on right now. The Quakers were like that. So the Holy Spirit comes upon you and your body starts responding to it very strongly. And the early Quakers, their original name was the Society of Friends, but the nickname came from their bodily reactions to the Spirit. So there were some Quakers that retained that more ecstatic kind of response to the Holy Spirit. And that's the sect that Anne Lee joined as a young woman. She was baptized in the Church of England. She was actually baptized in the cathedral in Manchester. So here she is, highly religious, very poor, working in the basically industrial slavery that was in place in a place in Manchester in the mid 18th century. Her parents had enough of her resistance to marriage, and so in 1761 they actually forced her into a marriage, and within short succession she became pregnant 4 times. She had 4 very, very, very difficult pregnancies, and shortly after each one of the children was born, her offspring died. And so she didn't want to get married. We don't know much about her husband. I kind of have wondered when I read the primary source material if he was abusive. It seems like that might be the case. He clearly didn't like her very much for a reason I'll tell you in a moment. And she gets pregnant as she's supposed to, and it's just tragic consequences. It's in the 1760s, after all of this has happened to her, she begins to preach. And interestingly enough, she becomes a leader in this sectarian group of Quakers, and people start flocking to hear her. Indeed, not only does she preach, but she apparently has a gift of healing. There are all kinds of reports that Anne Lee could touch someone and that they would be healed of whatever ailment they were suffering from. It's in this decade that she begins to formulate some very specific kinds of theological perspectives. One is that true faith demands celibacy. Surprise! I think this might have caused a little trouble in her marriage, but that was part of being a real follower of Jesus, was refraining from sexual relations, even for married couples. Then confession, that people were to confess their sins to one another. And she also believed that Christ was going to return very soon. So celibacy, confession, and the imminent return of Christ became sort of her 3 hallmarks of teaching. Now, you all might kind of think that's a little odd. It's like, uh-oh, this is not going to end well. But whenever I read about early Anne Lee and her healing gifts, the fact that she's a preacher that attracts women and other believers to this sectarian community, and she's interested in celibacy, confession, and the return of Christ, I think about medieval mystics. I mean, Anne Lee's views in the mid 1700s really resemble some of the views about the women mystics you read about in the 12, 13, and 1400s. And so here's this woman who's kind of out of time. In the Middle Ages, she might have stood up to her father and said, "I'm going off to the convent." But she lived in Protestant industrial England, and so there was no convent for her to go to. And so instead of just sort of take it's because celibacy was a way that many women before birth control, before women's rights movements, celibacy was a way that many women could take a hold of their own empowerment, to remove themselves from the control of male fathers or their husbands, their fathers or husbands, and create a female world in which they could fully express themselves. And so in earlier centuries in Catholic Europe, there would have been a place to do that, but there's no place to do that in Manchester, England, for a woman who grew up working in a cotton factory. And so she begins to enact this kind of spirituality in this very sectarian Quaker setting. Well, she got in a lot of trouble. The English authorities did not like her at all. As a matter of fact, they accused her. This is one of my favorite moments in church history, is that the Church of England accuses Anne Lee of dancing and shouting on the Sabbath. And if that isn't like the most Anglican thing you've ever heard, is throwing someone in jail for dancing in church. And so she goes to prison, not once, but several times, for breaking the Sabbath laws of the Church of England, for causing disruption. And finally, in 1774, she has enough of it. And she has had a vision of Christ, revealing to her that there is a new and better world, that the kingdom is dawning. And she takes 8 of her followers. They get on a ship, and this is including her husband, and they go to New York, where they're going to start a community that embodies the teachings of the kingdom of God. Almost as soon as they get there, the husband runs away into the wilderness. We never hear about him again. He probably goes to Rhode Island. Um, but we literally don't know what happened. And Anne Lee and her followers begin establishing what becomes known as the Shakers, the Universal Friends of Christ community. And in 1779, they find their first sort of communal space in a town outside of Albany, New York, where they establish a community that's based on these principles of celibacy, confession, and the imminent return of Christ. And it's also based on economic principles of the early church. No one has any ownership of any property, and everyone shares everything. They create a cooperative farm in which they all work together, and they do that during the week. So they own the means of their own production, and they own the results of everything that they make. And they also have worship. And so on Sunday, they have these incredible sort of ecstatic worship experiences. That is the Quaker dancing and singing that comes to be known through history. We still have one of Anne Lee's songs that many people sing. It's kind of a classic part of American music. "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where we ought to be." And that's a song from the early Quaker communities. Not only were they basically Book of Acts communists who practiced celibacy and who enacted confession one to another as the body of Christ, but they were also pacifists. And so in 1780, during the middle of the American Revolution, Anne Lee was arrested in Massachusetts. She is one of the figures in early American history who bears the honor of being arrested by people on both sides of the Atlantic and thrown in jail for having repulsive theological or social views, according to the state. She she gets out after a few months, and she's actually quite in ill health. She won't live terribly much longer, only 4 more years. But her arrest created this kind of aura of persecution around her, and it actually attracted followers to her community. And by the time of her death, the Shakers were known as reliable, trustworthy neighbors with incredibly great farms, and a lot of non-Shakers would do things like drop off their orphaned, if like a husband lost his wife, couldn't take care of his children, they would drop off their children with the Shakers to be raised in Shaker community. And so, despite the fact that the Shakers practiced celibacy and didn't actually have their own children, there were a lot of children around in Quaker communities because they kind of served as orphanages when there were no kind of state homes for people who couldn't take care of their children. So Anne Lee is this really interesting and complete figure. Many people thought that she was actually the female embodiment of Christ, which is an amazingly kind of feminist theology idea, well in advance of anything that will resemble feminist theology. And that she somehow expressed what the Quakers refer to as the universal Christ consciousness, and that all people could access that consciousness through these worship experiences and through practicing these simple acts in community of service and work. So essentially she sets up an ideal for America. This is how I think she's a prophet. She sets up a vision. She has a vision. She has lots of visions. And she sets up a community based on those visions of an alternate kind of America, an America without capitalism, an America that is pacifist, an America where there is no longer male and female, an America that's essentially all people can come in contact with God. The Shakers did not believe in slavery. They had a bit of a quarrel about it, but very quickly fell down on the abolition side. And there were people who came up from the South who had been held in slavery that escaped slavery and found themselves in Quaker community. So it became a very important pathway to freedom for formerly enslaved people, especially in Ohio and in other places that were right along the slave borders. So I just think it's a really interesting thing. Here's this woman born in complete poverty, who herself is so peripheral, who never learns how to write, and yet has a vision. And it's in this setting of what she understands to be the new world that she basically enacts Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female, for we are all one in Christ. And she links that with Acts chapter 2, in economic vision and practices of community. And the art and architecture that has moved on from there, I think, is remarkable. Now, it's interesting to talk about sort of this proto-feminist mystic I think Anne Lee I find her so compelling because she embodies this sort of impulse in Christianity that comes out of the Middle Ages. And yet for Protestant women in the 18th century, there was no place to put it. And so she creates a place. And nobody has to tell her to do this. She's just kind of following the impulse of the Holy Spirit. And at the very same time, she anticipates what will become feminist and womanist theologies, I think, in the 20th century. And so she's an unnoticed sort of transition figure in the history of Christianity. And I think she's a less than well-regarded prophet of what American society could have looked like. And that brings us to my second person, and I'm going to link her in and then turn back over to Tripp, is Fannie Lou Hamer. A lot of you are going to be more familiar with who Fannie Lou Hamer is because she was a voting rights activist. Fannie Lou Hamer was born to sharecroppers in Mississippi in 1917. There is actually one public statue of Fannie Lou Hamer. It is in Ruleville, R-U-L-E, Ville, V-I-L-L-E, Mississippi, which was mostly the place she lived for most of her life. She tells her own story about how at 6 years old, the person who owned the farm, the plantation owner, they were still called plantation owners, even though they're sharecroppers now instead of enslaved people. small difference there. But she tells the story of how she was 6 years old and recovering from polio when the farmer, the plantation owner, drove by in his truck and sees her out in the front yard and says, "Why aren't you out in the fields picking cotton?" And she says, "Well, I've been sick." And the farmer says, "Oh, I bet you're so sort of thin that you couldn't even pick 30 pounds of cotton. But if you can pick 30 pounds of cotton, I'll take you over to the commissary and I'll buy you Cracker Jacks on Saturday if you can prove to me that you can do this." And so she's 6 years old. She goes out to the field. She finds her mother and her father, and she says, the farmer says he'll buy me Cracker Jacks if I can pick 30 pounds of cotton. How do I pick the cotton? And so she does. She goes into the field and she picks 30 pounds of cotton. And the sharecropper plantation owner actually kept his word. And he took her off and got her Cracker Jacks and a couple other little treats from the commissary after she did that picking for him, as he promised. Well, she went to school for a while. But the school wasn't really what she liked. She did learn how to read and write, but she dropped out when she was 13 years old because at that time, not only was she going to the sharecropper kids' school, the terrible school on these plantations, but she was also picking somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of cotton per week. And so she shifted from being a student to being a worker in this really horrible kind of economy that Mississippi had developed. She tells a story about how when she was 13 years old, she looked at her mother, because she's smart enough to kind of see the world around her. And she says, "Mama, how come we isn't white?" And her mother said this, and this is the exact quote to her: "You don't understand now, but you will. There's nothing wrong with you being black. If God had wanted you to be another color, you'd be another color. Don't be ashamed of being black. Respect yourself as a child, and when you get older, respect yourself as a black woman." And as a result of that conversation, her mother gave her a black doll. And it was the only doll that Fannie Lou Hamer ever owned, a black doll. Respect yourself. I don't quite know what happened around the time she was 13. 13 is often a very tender time for women's spirituality. 13 is like the time in which the young girls in the Salem witch trials began to have visions and kicked off that whole episode in Salem, Massachusetts. 13 is often a time when young women were sent to monasteries and convents when they were in the Middle Ages. But something happened to Fannie Lou at 13. I actually kind of don't wonder if it was sexual assault, the way that the rest of her story unfolds. But I do not know that for sure from her story. And I'm still doing research to try to figure out what happened to her. But she says this about that year, about when she was wondering about being why God didn't make her white. She said, after this whole thing that happened with her mother, she said, I began to understand. And I prayed to God that if I got older, isn't that interesting? If I get older, if you give me the chance just to live and get grown, I'll get myself out on the streets and devote my life to seeing that things will be different for everybody, for every poor person in the state of Mississippi. And that's really kind of where she goes. I think that here, the image that I pull off of is the image of St. Francis, is the identification of a person who finds themselves as an outsider. And it's an identification completely with Christ and with the poor. And so what begins to frame her are the stories of the Bible. She said, we had always been told that we had to suffer as Christ suffered. But I began to think in terms of what David had to do. David was a shepherd boy who had to slay Goliath. And so that's really the direction that she begins to take her identification with the church, or with the Bible. It's just not about suffering. Black people had done a lot of that, and she felt like it had gotten them just deeper into poverty. But could Black people take on the role of David and slay the Goliath of what held them back? And so the rest of her story is pretty well known, and I love it. In 1960, she's in her early 40s. Only 5% of Black Mississippians were registered to vote. In 1961, she became quite ill. She was married, and she and her husband never been able to conceive, and they always wanted children, and they discovered that she had cysts on her uterus. And so she went in to the doctor to have the problem fixed, and the doctor, without her permission, gave her a hysterectomy. She was a victim of forced sterilization. And so, of course, there would be no children in her natural children in her future. She did wind up, she and her husband, adopting 2 children. So she had this terrible, tragic set of painful events happen in 1961. In 1962, freedom riders came to her town, and they held different rallies. She was 44 years old, and when they came, she never knew until they arrived that Black people actually had the constitutional right to vote. That had been kept a secret from her. And so she just like woke up and started linking her spiritual experiences, her experiences of being a poor woman, her experiences of the Bible, with activism around the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and became very active in it, went to some of their national meetings, etc., and began to work for voter registration in Mississippi. She herself tried to register to vote in 1962. When she did, the sharecropper whose farm she and her husband worked on threatened her, and they had to move off their land. They moved into someone else's house, and that house was, when she was there, was shot at by, and it was an attempted murder against her. She would not stop. She met with the freedom riders. They began going through all of Mississippi. This poor woman, barely could read and write, getting people registered to vote. And then came, in June 1963, one of the worst episodes of the civil rights movement, was when she was arrested along with 5 others in Winona, Mississippi, for sitting at a counter. They weren't even trying to get people to register to vote. They were just trying to exercise their constitutional right to have a diet or have a Coke after they had a hard day of work trying to get people to register for voting. And they were put in a jail. And what was said when they were arrested is, "We're going to make you all wish you were dead." And it was the testimony of what happened over those 4 days in jail that was read to the Democratic National Committee in the summer of 1964. And it was this testimony that she gave in front of the Democratic National Committee that was, everyone knew that it was going to be explosive, because everyone had heard that something terrible had happened to Fannie Lou Hamer in that jail, and it was terrible. She was, the white officers forced 2 Black prisoners to beat her within an inch of her life. She bore the scars of that for the rest of her life, and a white officer raped her. She was in a jail cell all by herself. There were other people, other women who had been also likewise treated in cells next to her. And the night of the worst of the beatings and the rape, Fannie Lou Hamer led those women in song as sign of their life in the face of such darkness and what they thought was their impending death. And so this testimony, everybody knew it was going to be something else. And as a matter of fact, when Fannie Lou Hamer got up to give it in 1964 on television on CBS, where it would be live carried throughout the whole nation, President Johnson quickly called a impromptu press conference Fannie Lou Hamer's picture was taken off of the screen, and President Johnson's face was put on, and President Johnson announced to the nation that it was the 9-month anniversary of the shooting of President Kennedy. And the nation was deprived of Fannie Lou Hamer's story live that night. That raised a lot of anger and curiosity, and so the testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer shows up in every national newspaper outside of the South the next day. This kind of work that she did, and this is where I want to finish, is that she saw the intersection between voting rights, education, and economic opportunity. And she knew that all three of these were of a piece, and that America would never be the kind of America that it needed to be until these three issues and concerns were addressed. She is the one who uttered the famous phrase, "We are sick and tired of being sick and tired." She talked about how all she had ever done was suffer. She was an amazing preacher. She was known for her lectures and sermons throughout the South and at civil rights events. And so these words I find very moving. Luke 4:18 says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach, because he anointed me to preach good news to the poor." It was his purpose, preaching to the poor. Mostly what the middle class does, the white and black middle classes, is they are concerned about people who already got something. They aren't trying to bring the change for people who don't have anything. And that's the hypocrisy of this entire country. She talked about how the contemporary lynching was keeping contemporary lynching, not the actual lynchings of 50 years earlier, but contemporary lynching was in its more subtle forms of keeping Black children from school, of keeping them in poverty, of keeping them hungry. We've never been paid for our work, and we are fighting for the rights of all human beings. And guess what she did? In 1969, Fannie Lou Hamer decided she was going to do something about it, and she created a farmers cooperative in Mississippi called Freedom Farm. She set up a utopian community in order that Black people would own the land, would own the source of their own production, and would eat what they themselves had produced. And she talked about how she was not ashamed. She says, "I am not ashamed of being Black. I am not ashamed of my history." And she stood up in order for economic prosperity to be extended to all the people in Mississippi. Someone said in the comments that they couldn't believe the parallels between Fannie Lou Hamer and Ann Lee. I couldn't either when I read the two women's stories together. Two women so different, and yet both of them leaning towards the same kinds of scriptures, leaning into the power of women's voices. One born as a cog in a cotton industry in Manchester, England, and the other born in a cog of cotton industry in the American South 200 years later. Both victims of deep exploitation, and both with an incredible vision for what America could be. Fannie Lou Hamer did not hate white people. She said there are so many good people in this country, and we speak out until all those good people got the courage to speak out too. And I think that's what Ann Lee was ultimately about. Everybody finding their voice and finding a place in faith. And yet this more recent saint, Fannie Lou Hamer, she also sounded a warning. Whereas Ann Lee came at the beginning of the story, Fannie Lou Hamer comes in a much, much later part in the story. And she said, "It's 2:02 p.m. And I wonder if we're on our way out." And then these words, this is where I want to end. It's hard for me to stand up and sing the national anthem because actually, the land of the free and the home of the brave has meant to most Black people in this country the land of the tree and the home of the grave.
Wow. Thank you, Diana. I mean, I'd give you an A++, if I was grading.
Well, it's a weird combination to put together, but that was basically I would have written that essay in one of those old-fashioned blue books in advanced seminar in American religious history if I'd had a chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of time, but I think we should do a few questions and such. I'll just say everyone should, the whole bit on Lincoln I had was about the nature of his determined charity when the presence of the divine is hidden in history. And he had this big vision of what the liberal democratic project looked like. And he recognized, as a poor working class person in Illinois, the problems with capitalism as it was changing, right? And so he invested in law, and he had this vision of how we're going to get through it and such. And then over time, it got worse, right? And the challenge of slavery became a contradiction in the system that he saw, but there was no easy solution to it. And I was so fascinated by the way his rational explanations and things broke. And then someone who left behind religion in any practicing Christian type of way from his kind of militantly Calvinist parents, returns to theology as the language to think about how do you seek the good when you can't name its presence, and how do you go forward, and what does that mean, right? And part of the legacy of his Calvinism that was there, like that we're not free, then you can't equate someone's worth to their worst decisions. And so he had that, the charity for all bit and all that kind of stuff. When you think about someone who experienced his presidency through the Civil War as God's judgment of the entire nation and insisted that humility and charity was required, he did that while being faithful to what he saw as the good. But the other was not something you couldn't cultivate charity for, and one's confidence isn't something you would shed humility for. And I think for me, and thinking of what my kids over here, that I worry that I lack the humility or the confidence that charity should be my disposition towards people on the other side. And you'll see it when it's 800 words, less than 800 words, the second inaugural address, but it's a beautiful picture of what determined charity and divine hiddenness can look like when wrestling with the public square. And I think I don't like, what does faithfulness look like when the story you inherited politically, culturally, religiously, institutionally shattered? For him by the Civil War, for us, we're picking up pieces, right? And what should you stay connected to your enemy? If you do, well, how? What does it mean? What is the democratic experiment worth? How do you have a disposition to charity? All those kind of questions he spent so much time wrestling with when I was reading his biography, that I'm very familiar with how more progressive types criticize Abraham Lincoln. I also recognize in his time how so much of at least what we have in text of African American responses use a lot of the imagery of Moses and such for understanding that experience. And I get that current way historians do the contesting, but the thing I found so challenging is like what was his animating desire. And it was the way humility enabled him to be passionate about what he saw as the good without claiming God's fullness on it, and recognizing charity as the task for how he engages across difference. Because
I think
that's
I
not my
think it's
natural disposition, Diana.
well, I think it's really interesting too about Abraham Lincoln, and to hold up the fact that he was spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
He was not for the vast majority of his life a church member, and so he was a sort of a post-Christian, you know? And one of the things that's interesting about all four of these people, and it's funny to do Hamer first and then Lincoln second, because in a sense, Hamer's experience comes out of the failed vision. I mean, Lincoln's vision ultimately fails, and it fails on the boulder of American racism and Jim Crow, and so there's this glorious Lincoln-esque possibility. And I think that Hamer sort of harkens back to that in interesting ways, but through this prism of incredible suffering that Black people are still enduring in all these decades past slavery. So, just as we get ready to move into the Q&A, one of the things that really strikes me about all four of these characters, Roger Williams, of course, went to Cambridge University, and he's an author, and he was an established religious figure, ordained minister, all this sort of stuff, and Lincoln being the president. Those guys seem, in a sense, pretty privileged in that way, but they were also, all of these people had trauma in their lives. Both of the women that I share about had sexual trauma, very specifically, and male to female violence directed at them. And so that's a particular kind of trauma, but they're all four people who lost something that was meaningful to them, and reshaped their identities in the losing, and that they had to sort of crawl out of these dark places with whatever spiritual, emotional, and character resources they had, not to become the hero of everybody's story, but to simply shine within the context of their own lives, and to carry on what they believed with deep passion was the mission that the universe or God was calling them to. So I have a lot of admiration for all four of these people for those reasons.
Mm-hmm. So, so remember, everyone, that we are definitely looking forward, either in the Facebook group or responding to emails and such, to let us know who you'd pick for these particular themes today: visionaries and prophets. Now, here, Diana, here's one of the questions. You, in talking about Mother Ann Lee and Fannie Lou Hamer and Roger Williams, all three had this experiment in alternative communities, be it Freedom Farm, right, the Shakers community, Providence, Rhode Island. Are there particular themes, as a historian, you see across history when faith inspires kind of communal experiments? You mentioned a few, like the Acts 2 passage is one that shows up, but if you were thinking of abstracting from your wealth of knowledge, what are the normal kind of inertias or centering ideas when people create community as the prophetic alternatives?
I can immediately respond to that, and that is, I think when certain kinds of people experience economic systems as having collapsed so completely that they allow for no justice, no room for the human soul, and no possibility for any kind of real liberty. That some people in that kind of situation will escape and construct these alternatives. And that was the case for all three of these figures today, is that they were all Lincoln's a different kind of figure. But he grew up in a frontier, which is a really interesting sort of alternative community too, although less intentional than these three. But these three people all felt exploited by the link of church and state and by corporations. I mean, corporate entities, the corporate entity of the plantation, the corporate entity of sort of the Puritan economy of New England, the corporate entity of whoever was running that mill in Manchester. And so this is where some of the Marxist analysis of these moments in history is quite correct. Is that you treat people like this over the long haul, and they're going to revolt, and they're going to try to seize back some level of control. And all three of these people are doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is it's one of those kind of features you even see play out like in the biblical stories, that like when exploitation as exploitation arises and then awareness of it, then the energy of the divine is often it transposes itself from justifying the domination system to overturning it and in resisting it.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's one. Any connection between Roger Williams and Thomas Helwys, founder of the First Baptist Church in England, who wrote a treatise on religious freedom, which he dedicated to James I? Yes, there's a connection. But that's all I remember. I just know there is one because I reread all my notes from Bill Leonard, who y'all met at the previous sessions, Baptist history class. But, I didn't read those closely. But I would say, though, if people are interested in it, Bill's book called Baptist Ways is probably the most authoritative Baptist history textbook. And it tells the whole story of Baptist life, from its founding. So Helwys and Smith with a Y, because that always sounds cool. I don't know. Is there something else there, Diana?
No, I was going to say, I remember there being some connection too. I could not tell you off the top of my head. And when I have a historical question like that, one of the things I do is go to that little Google bar and I type in connection between Roger Williams and Thomas Helwys. And lo and behold, some article from some journal will pop up and you'll be able to at least read the first paragraph of
it. Okay, Elliot asked, and I think this was in discussion of while you were talking, was she illiterate? How did she learn the Bible? And I think it was during when you were talking about Mother Ann Lee, because you mentioned her being illiterate up front.
Yeah, well, lots of people, of course, before the early 20th century were illiterate and knew the Bible. And that was because they learned it orally. So if you were in a church community, and she was baptized both Church of England and she was part of this Quaker sect, there would have been Bible everywhere. And so people learned it through hearing it. And then Fannie Lou Hamer, she knew how to read at a nuts and bolts level from that terrible sharecropper school. And so she could read and write as well. And it was clear, oh my gosh, if Fannie Lou Hamer could have gone to college, oh Lord have mercy, she would have been Angela Davis, or she would have run for, she said she was going to run for Senate at one point. I mean, what an amazing, intelligent woman she was, and so gifted. And what a tragedy to have her life be, her intellectual life of learning in that way, not have an outlet when she was a teenager in her 20s. So yeah, those women were mostly very severely undereducated.
All right. Let's see. Linda asked, I was adopted. All of my life I've held values contrary to the family I grew up in. What part does our innate leaning, say left or right, influence whom we believe is a saint or an icon?
Well, a lot. I think that was one of the points I made at the outset, is that the values we hold, it's a paradoxical relationship, is that we look to these people and we emulate them, and so they begin to shape our values. But the people we choose to look at are often the people we look at because of things that we already hold to be, at least once we get to a particular age. And so, yes, it has a huge play on it. And this is where things like conversions and listening to the Holy Spirit and education and all sorts of other things come in to sort of bend the arcs of our lives and point us in directions that we wouldn't normally look. I mean, that's so. Um, I think that these kinds of leanings are always present because of what the environment we grow up in, but our leanings can change through outside influence, and oftentimes that is really important. I mean, it's always really important, actually, I think.
Yeah. So one of the members in the Facebook group, which just so you all know, if you comment from watching in the Facebook group, your actual name or anything doesn't come up here. So it is set for private. That is because some people in this group don't want everyone that might be in the, on the internet to see their name. But the question is, how do we balance a delicate excavation of history with the urgency of action? And there was another question that was very similar. Cindy, who was echoing Wendy in the chat. How do we be a neighbor and advocate for those who are doing for those doing harm to others? So I think that both of those questions kind of get at wanting to understand how to wrestle with that delicate tension of the excavation work and the urgency of what's before us.
I'd like to hear how you handle that, Tripp, as I just make a couple of points. Part of it depends on who you are and what you're called to do. Is that every one of us has sort of particular kinds of passions and callings on our lives, that vocation, the vocatio that emerges for us. And so, there have been times when I was literally, like, I remember when the whole protests were going on in Ferguson. It just happened to be a moment when I was finishing, I think it was Grounded, one of my books. And I was on this really tight deadline when I got a call from Jim Wallace, and he said, "Come to Ferguson with us." And I literally had to sit there and decide between doing the delicate work of the writer historian, sitting in my office, or being on the streets in Ferguson. It was really, really hard to make that choice. And ultimately, I thought to myself, there are people who are going to go to Ferguson who are absolutely called to go to Ferguson and who know how to do this. And that is what their lives are all about all the time. And I'm going to give that space to those people. And there are other people like me who are actually more called to doing the story crafting part of activism work. And there are fewer people doing this, and I just feel like I need to be at my desk. And I remember how hard that was for me to adjudicate that, and how guilty I felt about it for a while. But that's kind of what you just have to do. You have to ask yourself, who am I? What is this moment? And where does my work lean more toward God's love and justice in the world? And that answer becomes different for all of us. So I say, do your work of discernment, figure it out. And yet there are other times when I'm out on the street with people all the time. If there's no deadline or what have you, find me at the local protest rally, standing in front of the White House, especially during the Trump years, yelling obscenities to the guy inside. So, oh. I'm sorry to confess that, but Ann Lee got me all inspired to confess my sins.
Well, they're forgiven.
Thank you.
That question, I actually thought about how it's changed just even in my own life. I remember when Alicia and I had our first kid, her saying, "Now you're not going to go get yourself arrested, keep getting, arrested at protests and stuff. Right." And, that there was like a different kind of expectation and responsibility that was there, and I was like really uncomfortable with it because in my mind, the, I was first. My faith got really passionate and deep in response to the failed Christian response to 9/11, and so all sorts of violence things around the exploitation of militarism, ugly nationalism. That I was in North Carolina where the death penalty was illegal, action done by the state. So these kind of war, death, and such, and then eventually I came to recognize the way our economic system played into it, and being present in protest seemed was always something I could do as like the straight white man who is a minister. I would and large. You just kind of sit there, and that's the only time I really dress like a minister. But and I remember the shift of our conversation when we had Elgin. I mean, like, then what do you do? So I told my youth after that, whenever I confirmed them, that until my kids get a little older, unless the family's going to the protest, which has happened a few times, I'm not doing what I used to do, but I'm more than happy to bail them out. And and I say it was a fun joke of going like, I used to try to take all my high schoolers before they go to college to their first protest. So when they get to college, they're like, oh yeah, I remember how to do this. I learned at youth group, that kind of thing. But telling them, look, if you need to get bailed out, I got to outsource the on the street thing while I have kids. And I remember that like shift, and I'm not saying everyone should do it, but that's why I think the question's important. And like the question of like, how do you think about what you're doing? And then the larger picture. Right. The other is, I think you're right about call, or like using Paul's imagery of different parts of the body have different gifts. There are a lot of people who, for them to have woven together Mother Anne's story and Franny Lou Hamer's in that amount of time in an inspiring way without having to cross your historical fingers, they would spend hours and hours to get the first paragraph done, and then others. But you've invested your gift in knowing history and communicating to a larger audience. And so that is a way of gifting the whole. And that doesn't mean everyone that enjoys it has to go get a PhD and do all that kind of stuff. I feel similar when talking to people that are wrestling and like getting rid of ugly parts of their religious tradition. And then I think to myself, well, I mean, if you think about where that came from, like, and I go into diagnosing it and thinking about the big picture and like how it relates to this and that. Like sometimes people they're like, no, like, tell me what you believe in a beautiful and compelling way, and I'll trust that you spent too much time thinking about the philosophy and science parts. And I get that. I used to think, oh, you should probably go read everything I read, so then you'll know how good I am, right? And I realize that's not my vocation. So much of like even doing community things like this, there are plenty of people we make space for in doing this who they might be here by themselves. Then there are others that are with communities, their community of faith or a group of friends, and I see like even raising these stories up and then hearing the stories people share as a way of fertilizing the ground with the narratives of the saints of past, right? To figure out, like, for the individual, for the community, for the small group and such, like, what are the ways we inherit these stories? And the thing that the thing that struck me the most about the Roger Williams story in response to this is he didn't know where he was going. He just knew that the means to being faithful to God were not available in the community he was in. So he had to make another one. And I think we're at one of those spaces where people that follow Christ, or at least those of us attempting to, are seeing so many communities where we don't think we can do it there. And that kind of risk of, what do you do when you've been kicked out for a good reason? Well, his solution wasn't create the community of perfection. His response was to create a community where the dignity of his neighbor was valued. and he got to be fully himself. And I think that is a different way of seeing each of our contributions to a response. They look different, and it doesn't have to be universal, but we can figure out, in a sense, how to be good neighbors and how to start to move towards faithfulness.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important. At least this is one thing that I've learned from my own life, is to, when the choice comes in front of me, which of these paths to take, and I choose to take the quiet path, of doing that responsible, archaeological excavation work that I have to do. I sometimes sit and ask myself very directly, is making this choice, which I know is the main choice of my vocation, is it somehow eliminating the possibility of risk on the other side of the ledger? And so I try to be honest with myself about that. Is there some moment when I'm trying to avoid my fear, or avoid something, that does seem a little riskier, by saying, oh, well, I'm at home, I'm writing this really important book. And I don't want to do that either. I don't want to use what I know is my primary vocation as a way of avoiding risk that might open me up to some aspect of my vocation that I don't already see. And so I do think that there is a kind of a holy maturity of putting myself once in a while in a place where I feel the opposite of my vocation, just to kind of experiment with where I am on the path to God and with God. And, sometimes I learn a lot in that way, showing up at some place I just don't want to be. And I have done that on many occasions, showed up at a place where I just thought, this is a waste of time or whatever. And oh my gosh, sometimes those places hold huge surprises, and then redirect in some important way the primary vocation. So I just encourage people, just be sensitive to where God is, and know what your vocation is, and know what you're afraid of, and know what you love, and always be trying to pursue where is love calling you to at this moment. And so, and I really value, I always hear the words echoing in my brain, the letter from Birmingham jail, and the condemnation of the white moderate from Martin Luther King Jr. And I just think that's something that middle-class white people always have to hold in their ears. And so I adjudicate my work not only on terms of my own vocation, but with the memory of these kinds of saints shouting from the streets, what needs to be done. And that's why these people are so important, is that they do get us out of those boxes we sometimes place ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, it's been fun. And I thank you all for hanging out. And if you're watching later, thank you for watching later or listening later. We will be back next week. Same time. We'll be talking about artists and innovators are the themes of sainthood next week. But we're looking forward to hearing who you would nominate for the Visionaries and Prophets for this week.
I love this about this class, is Tripp and I are not creating an inclusive list to put statues up on Monument Avenue and our word is the last word. This is really about inviting you all to put into the chats, into the comments, reply on Twitter, wherever you want to reply, people that inspire you to lean more deeply into God's love and justice in the world. And in this week, we want those visionaries and prophets. We want to hear all those names that are the people who you want to see held up as models and examples in the world.
Yeah, and there are quite a few people that mentioned people in the chat who I think are on our list on other weeks. So we'll see. You just imagine how the drafting of Saints went when Diana and I each had our list, and
we should have had that recorded.
It's like the NBA All-Star game where they draft the players in front of everyone. Yeah, no, see, that's awkward enough if you like leave out someone on your own team or a previous teammate in the draft. Like, it's different altogether when you're like, no, they're not sainty enough for me.
I know, it was actually kind of embarrassing. Oh, no, really? Mother Teresa? No, no, no. Well, we didn't actually say that, but that was kind of the direction it was going sometimes. So it was really fun. So
Yeah.
anyway, thanks everybody for coming today. And thanks for joining in with our wild Lenten project here. We're glad you come along for the fun.
All righty.